Alright, so today we're talking about Shaman in Classic, and Shaman's in an interesting place. They're able to run pretty much any archetype, but each of those archetypes tends to have one or two really unfavorable matchups, which makes the class just less appealing to play. But with the matchups that are favorable, a lot of times they're very, very favorable. There's some pretty good stuff in here. So I want to start by looking at this Burst Shaman. Now, you can run something like this that is very bursty, or something that's just kind of a more normal aggro list. That would have more kind of board control elements as opposed to these chargers, but let's just look at this for a little bit before we get into that. So the curve obviously is very aggressive. So here on the early drops, we've got some ones, we've got the typical twos, stuff that's pretty good. But generally what you're hoping to do here is just send damage at your opponent's face, right? Not that surprising for Burst, but what makes this deck so good is that cards like Lava Burst, Lightning Bolt, you can use as finishers and not have the drawback of Overload while still blasting your opponent through taunts. So these kind of early minions, this early minion presence, and even like Wolf Rider, Arcane Golem here, that's there to chip away at your opponent's health. You can actually, deal a good 15-20 damage in just a handful of turns. And then once you get to the end, finish them with something like, Lava Burst, Lightning Bolt. Maybe you get a Leroy Wind Fury. Maybe you're dropping the Wind Fury early on the Arcane Golem. Obviously, it's got the Doomhammer Rockbiter combo, having two of them in there just for the consistency of being able to draw it. There's so many ways to burst your opponent down, to finish them. And with Earthshock, you're able to get through single taunts as well on the same turn. The reason I love this variant of an aggressive Shaman so much is because I think this level of burst will kill so many decks before they're able to either get their combo pieces off or before they're able to burst you down, if that's kind of their goal. So if you're facing something like Zoo, them tapping is kind of working in your favor. You don't have to worry about lightning storms to wipe their board or anything like that. Because you're so aggressive, because you have that burst ability, generally speaking, they're going to be kind of trying to clean up your minions. They'll secure the board, but by the time they secure the board, you can just send damage right at them. Similar sort of thing for Miracle Rogue, right? They need time to develop. They're going to be picking away at your smaller minions, but it's really easy. 6 mana Doomhammer Rockbiter to just deal tons of damage. Leroy Wind Fury. You're going to do that before they get up to 8+ mana for their Leroy Double Shadow Step. So it's very, very good. But yeah, if you do want to cater this to be a little bit more typical, I would suggest these two cards could be removed, the Wolf Rider and Arcane Golem, for something like Harvest Golem and maybe Flame Tongue Totem. That way you're playing in a more similar style to something like Zoo. It probably helps in matchups like Warrior, where they're going to extend their health beyond 30. They've got lots of really good removal tools. And having something like Harvest Golem, it's going to be a little bit stickier on the board. Flame Tongue Totem is also going to work well with your hero power, which generally you're not going to be using too much in this matchup because you're just trying to push damage. But in those longer matchups against Control Warrior, you might be forced to when you're kind of low on cards. So yeah, really, really highly recommend this if you're facing a lot of Miracle Rogue. And it's pretty good in other matchups. I think some sort of aggro or burst Shaman might be my go-to Shaman when it comes to climbing and being competitive. I really do think there's a place for something like this in the meta, and you can do quite well for yourself. Now next I want to take a look at Midrange. Midrange also has a lot of flexibility in how you build it. For example, I love Nat Pagle. It works very well with Flame Tongue. If you do have a Defender of Argus in a list like this, which can fit, it also really benefits. Bumping this up to a 1/5 will increase your survivability. I've only got a single Drake here, so something like cutting Nat Peggle for another Drake can help round things out. Stormforged Axe, some people like, some people don't. And I'm also not a huge fan of Feral Spirits just because of the overload. So I've only got the Golems in here. But yeah, Unbound Elemental and Feral Spirits, they're also good cards. Some people think it's blasphemy that I don't run Feral Spirits. So a lot you can do here. But yeah, if you look at the curve, pretty typical mid-range. A lot of the stuff here early is like spells focused on removal. You're going to normally be using the Stormforged Axe for removal, as opposed to, you know, in that aggro deck, you could potentially get 6 damage to face with a little bit of board cleanup. This is, yeah, primarily going to be used against things like Leper Gnomes, Knife Jugglers, Flame Imps, all that kind of stuff. It's got a bit of taunt in there to round things out, just because you don't have heal here in this list, it's going to prevent some damage to your face. You're being proactive with fire elementals, and then you got Doomhammer and Alec here that can combo well with Rockbiter as a bit of a finisher. So something like this does extremely well against Control Warrior, so something that the aggro Shaman is going to struggle with. Because the hero power is going to get a lot of value, especially when you're comboing it with things like Flame Tongue. It's just something that demands removal. You could even slip in a single Bloodlust if you'd like to. I think this is kind of the only deck where you could really make it work. Probably still not recommended, but it's a little fun twist to put on it. But yeah, you're going very wide with this. You're getting lots of value out of your minions. And their single hard pieces of removal just don't generate enough value to really beat down this kind of mid-range deck. I find a lot of times when you're playing against Control Warrior, you'll actually end up getting down to fatigue. I've seen it on both ends. It's a very, very long matchup, and you're playing it for the long game in those control matchups. But it does tend to favor the Shaman. Now, where this deck falls flat is actually against Zoo. I think if Zoo was not a real part of the meta, and I mean it's everywhere, every server, every rank, I think this could be a top tier deck. It's got pretty good win rates right across the board, right? Something like Hex is good against Druids with like these single big targets. It's got AoE if you're a little bit more patient with things. It can do okay against Miracle Rogue, but I do think it sometimes struggles. You do rely on sort of a Doomhammer or Alec here, Rockbiter to be able to finish them off, get enough damage. But yeah, pretty solid across the board, except that Zoo matchup. It hinges so much on this Lightning Storm. 1, that you get it, and 2, a lot of times you need that 3 damage off of it. You don't always have a Thalnos to combo it with, because a lot of times you're going to need to play it on 3 or 4. You can't guarantee a spell power totem. There's a lot of randomness that goes into the spell power and the base damage of this, that it just won't consistently clear the board, and your early tools a lot of times aren't going to be enough. Zoo is just going to generally overtake the board. You're not going to be able to heal, and then it's tough to get enough damage on them. So yeah, if it wasn't for Zoo, if you're not facing a lot of Zoo, I think this is a good deck. You can climb in those other matchups, but because of it, that's what keeps me from playing mid-range Shaman too much. Of course, you can feel free to make some tweaks, maybe tech it into that, but if I was going to recommend anything, I think I would maybe lean into the control matchups. If you're just finding yourself at your ranks, you know, facing a lot of warrior or something like that, then yeah, mid-range, that's going to be your kind of go-to. Now next, getting away from aggro and mid-range, we'll just go right to a control Shaman here, which I think across the board is just going to have a lower win rate than both of the decks I just showed you. And I have a bit of a tough time even talking about the exact matchups this is good with. So what are we doing here with this deck? Well, we've got Wild Pyro, we've got Doomsayers, some cheap spells to combo with this to remove early board presence, right? Sweep the board, and even a bit of heal here But where it gets really interesting is these big boys comboed with Ancestral Spirit. So if you can get an Earth Elemental down, you're really going to want to play Ancestral Spirit on it. Potentially 2/7/8 taunts is just incredible. I mean, in any matchup, you can even faceless it. You could faceless it before something like that, or if you can secure an Earth Elemental on the board, follow it up with an Ancestral and a faceless. The same applies to Karen, the same applies to Sylvanas and Sunwalker. I think generally speaking, you need to drop Ancestral Spirit on taunts in most of your matchups, but hey, Sylvanas, still a very strong card, and yeah, really nice unless you're getting hit with silence. So something like this can struggle against Druid, which is going to be running 2 silences. You kind of need to get your combos off in the same turn, play an Earth Elemental and faceless it. And that's coming all the way on 10, which is very, very expensive. But then it does very good against Control Warrior, which often doesn't run any silences. It's pretty rare. You very rarely see that. But yeah, Warrior dealing with 2 Cairns, which can spawn, another Bane. It's just absolute poison for Brawl. Some of these bigger cards, yeah, really, really tough to deal with. And you've got Alex, which you can use defensively or offensively, depending on the matchup. Now, the reason I find it very difficult to gauge what matchups are good and what matchups are bad, I don't have a huge selection of games to draw from, but when you win, you absolutely steamroll your opponent. Usually it looks something like you Farsight into one of these big guys to reduce the cost, and then on a subsequent turn, you play one of these big guys along with like an Ancestral Spirit or a Faceless, and now you've got 2 big pieces, even an Execute, a Silence, something like that. They can't be removed, and every turn you're just beating the crap out of them. But when you lose, it's because you play Farsight into something like a Lightning Bolt or an Earth Shock. You get no value off of it. You're relying on making it to, 10 mana, 8 mana, and surviving. And that's very, very difficult in a lot of matchups. Of course, something like Zoo, Miracle Rogue, very difficult. Face Hunter is going to, generally speaking, demolish this. But yeah, when you win very, very hard. So, it's a deck you got to be patient with. You got to be willing to have some unlucky games where Farsight is just not pulling the right cards for you. But when it works, boy, it works. So I think it's a viable deck. Hard to recommend climbing too far with it, but yeah, I would probably put it below these 2 just because of its kind of wackiness. But maybe if you give it some time, some tender 11 care, maybe you're actually able to get a higher win rate than with these 2, but definitely going to have to be patient. Finally, we're going to take a look at Crusher's Shaman. Crusher, again, I'll shout him out. Classic streamer, does some stuff on YouTube. Crusher HS, very talented player, and this is, I guess you'd call it a control deck. It's doing kind of the same thing as that other control list. But I think this deck brings a bit more consistency. Again, I have a hard time gauging all the matchups and exactly how good it is. One of these things where Crusher is just a very talented player. I know he's played this deck at a high level, and I've been crushed by it a number of times. So, yeah, the name's appropriate as well. I like Warrior. This deck will absolutely demolish Warrior. If, again, you can get Ancestral Spirit off on any of these, you got the potential to lower their cost with Farsight. And it's got some of those early tools, double Earth Shock. It's only a single Wild Pyro, so a little bit harder to clear the board than with the previous deck. But it does do something that I really, really love, and that's it runs Ancestral Spirit. Now, this can be used along with Wild Pyromancer. It's a bit of a desperation play. It's very cheap. I'm sure there's a few situations early in the game where you might want to do it, but generally speaking, you've got Injured Blade Master getting a 3 mana 4/7 with taunt early against something that's trying to be aggressive is just so good. And again, if it wasn't hard enough for Warrior to deal with, removing the ability to execute an injured Blade Master is just so obnoxious. So that's a really nice combo. But he's also got the Black Knight in here. So you can do the same sort of thing you're doing with Mark of the Wild in Druid. You can actually taunt an enemy minion and then play the Black Knight to kill it. So a nice little combo. Another thing you'll notice about this deck is it's more proactive than the control list that I just showed you. So Fire Elemental, it's going to do something on the turn that you play it. Reg, it's doing something on the turn that you play it. And everything else is kind of, yeah, combo reliant. But you're not necessarily needing to get to 10 mana to pull off those combos, you know. Sylvanas, not going to do something when you play it in the other list. You've got those Sunwalkers. This, I think, just gives it a little more consistency, which is really nice because, yeah, the inconsistency of that other control deck can sometimes be very demoralizing, but this one, I think you're going to see a lot more consistency now that you have something like this, along with an injured Blade Master, Ancestral Healing, you know, 2 Earth Shocks. You can deal with early things a little bit better. And getting into the late game, guaranteeing some of that value. You're not going to steamroll as hard as you would in those control matchups. So, you know, if your goal is to just get 6 golden cairns on the board and, you know, laugh at your opponent's demise, then probably going to be slightly harder with something like this. But, hey, it's doable. It's a good deck. I'm sure it can get you to Legend if you put in the time to learn it. It plays a lot different than pretty much anything I think I've seen in Classic. It's very, very unique. Coming from Crusher, no surprise. But yeah, if you take the time to learn it, I think you'll do quite well. So, those are the 4 decks that I'm recommending for Shaman. I think there's a lot that you can do here. Yeah, you'll probably have varying levels of success, and a lot of it is matchup dependent, like I said. But Shaman does not get a lot of love in Classic, and I really think there's a lot of potential here. Across the board, depending on what you're facing, you should be able to use any one of these 4 decks to at least some efficacy, boost your win rate a bit, and yeah, climb that Classic ladder.